A cop tore up his documents and stomped on his dignity, not realizing he was humiliating the new attorney general. One moment of arrogance, and the entire system began to crack. What happened next shocked even those who had seen the worst. But let's start from the very beginning. Stephen Wilson, a 47-year-old black man, stepped out of the massive courthouse building, adorned with majestic columns and gleaming glass doors. The day had been long and exhausting. Endless hearings, discussions of legislative bills, and attempts to push necessary reforms in the justice system. Each of his steps echoed lightly on the courthouse stairs, his expensive gray suit looking flawless despite his fatigue. His polished leather shoes reflected the orange glints of the setting sun. Stephen's face showed both weariness and resolve, a combination honed through years of working in a system where the fight for justice demanded unyielding determination. His deep, dark eyes, framed by the first signs of crow's feet, radiated the confidence of a man used to defending the truth despite the obstacles. He took pride in being the state attorney general, but the position came with a burden of responsibility that sometimes felt overwhelming. Stephen took a deep breath of fresh air, trying to shake off the day's tension, and pulled his phone out of the inside pocket of his blazer. A message from his wife glowed on the screen, written with warm care. "Don't forget the surprise from the kids. We're waiting for you for dinner." He smiled involuntarily, imagining his children's faces glowing with excitement about the surprise. His home was the place where he could momentarily shed the mask of a public official and simply be a loving father and husband. However, his moment of joy was interrupted by the screech of tires on asphalt. A patrol car slowly rolled around the corner, its headlights brightly illuminating the street. Stephen turned toward the noise, his smile fading. The car door opened with a sharp creak, and Derek Harris stepped out, a white man around 40. His police uniform was impeccably pressed, and the badge on his chest gleamed as if he polished it every morning. Harris's eyes radiated arrogance and cold disdain, while a smug smirk played on his lips. "Hey, what are you doing here?" Harris snarled, his voice aggressive and confrontational. He approached slowly, his heavy boots clomping loudly on the sidewalk. Stephen raised his head and looked at Harris with unflappable calm. His back remained straight despite the growing tension in the air. "I'm just waiting for a car. Is there a problem?" His voice was even and controlled, but anxiety simmered inside him. Harris narrowed his eyes, his gaze filled with suspicion. It seemed like he was searching for a reason to escalate the situation, a pretext to assert his dominance. He didn't like the calm confidence of this man, didn't like that someone wasn't afraid of his authority. "Show me your ID," Harris snapped, extending his hand. Stephen silently pulled out a leather wallet from his inner pocket and, without breaking eye contact, handed over his identification. The silver Attorney General badge was clearly visible on the card. Harris studied the document for a few moments, his jaw tightening as if he were grappling with an internal conflict. Then his eyes flared with anger. Suddenly, with a sharp motion, he tore the document in half. The sound of ripping paper was deafening in the sudden silence. He tore it again and again until only tiny shreds remained, which he tossed at Stephen's feet. "Your authority means nothing here," Harris sneered, his voice dripping with venom. He stomped on the torn pieces with his heavy boot, grinding them into the pavement. A crowd began to gather. People pulled out their phones, switching on their cameras to record what was happening. Several murmured among themselves, their faces showing outrage and confusion. Stephen stood still, his fist clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths as he fought to maintain his composure. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not here. Not now. Harris wasn't going to stop. His movements radiated aggression, fueled by a sense of power and delusional superiority. He stepped forward and roughly grabbed Stephen by the elbow. Harris's fingers tightened like steel clamps, leaving painful marks on the fabric of the expensive suit. "Let's go to the station. We'll sort this out," he said, his voice cold and full of disdain, as if every word left a mark of arrogance in the air. His eyes sparked with malice, and the smirk on his face grew even more defiant. Stephen didn't flinch or let any fear or pain show. He lifted his chin higher, his gaze as firm as granite. His voice was steady, with no trace of doubt. "You're making a mistake." The words hung in the air like red-hot nails, impossible to ignore. Harris froze for a split second, then laughed. A short, dry laugh, dripping with sarcasm. "A mistake? Who do you think you are?" His smirk widened, and his eyes narrowed. He relished every moment of his illusion of power, oblivious to how close he was to disaster. The crowd around them grew larger. People pushed closer, straining their necks to get a better view. Smartphones rose into the air, their cameras flashing, capturing every moment. The tension in the air was like the heaviness before a storm. Then a voice rang out. Loud, clear, full of indignation and urgency. An elderly woman with gray hair stepped out from the crowd, her eyes blazing with outrage. "Do you even know who you're detaining? That's Stephen Wilson, the Attorney General." Those words sliced through the air like a sharp knife. Harris's smirk vanished instantly, as if washed away by a wave of icy water. The color drained from his face, and his eyes widened in shock and fear. The grip of his hand, which had been clutching Stephen with iron strength, suddenly weakened and faltered. He looked around, trying to process what he had just heard. Cameras continued recording, and faces in the crowd reflected condemnation and anger. Some whispered to each other, while others spoke out loud. "Did you see what he did? This is an outrage." Harris took an unsteady step back. His lips trembled, and he muttered, his voice now devoid of confidence. This is a misunderstanding." He glanced at Stephen, trying to cling to the remnants of his authority, but it was too late. The situation had spiraled out of control, like a broken machine beyond repair. The crowd relentlessly documented the events, each frame a piece of evidence of his misconduct. Stephen stood tall, his gaze cold and fearless. He knew this moment would become a catalyst for change. The air was pierced by the shrill sound of sirens, shaking the street and echoing in the hearts of the gathered crowd. Red and blue flashes from police lights reflected off the windows of nearby buildings, bathing the scene in a foreboding glow. The crowd instinctively parted, allowing patrol cars to move closer. People stood still, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene, as cameras continued to capture every moment. The door of the first car swung open, and out stepped Captain Mark Davis, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform. His stern gaze, accustomed to maintaining control, instantly changed when he saw Stephen Wilson. Mark's face contorted with horror as he realized the magnitude of the mistake that had just been made. He knew exactly who stood before him and understood that a catastrophic error had occurred. Mark stepped forward, his face a mixture of shame and indignation. His voice rang out loud and clear, slicing through the tense silence. "Sir, I apologize for what happened." The captain's words were directed at Stephen, but they conveyed a deep awareness of just how profoundly the system had failed. Mark turned to Officer Harris, his eyes blazing with anger he could barely suppress. His face reddened, his jaw clenched, and his voice was as hard as steel. "Officer Harris, you are suspended from duty." Those words landed like a verdict. They hung in the air, striking at Harris's self-esteem, confidence, and authority. The crowd gasped, then a murmur of approval spread through them. Some people started clapping, their faces shining with justified outrage and relief that justice was being served. Harris turned pale, his face twisted by a mix of fear and confusion. He stood frozen, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Slowly, with trembling hands, he unpinned the badge from his uniform. The metallic symbol of his power now felt meaningless and hollow. He placed the badge on the hood of the patrol car with a dull thud, a sound that seemed to punctuate the end of his career and reputation. The crowd continued to buzz. Someone shouted, "Serves him right! It's about time we got some justice!" Stephen exhaled, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He straightened, his back once again firm, his gaze resolute and unwavering. He looked at Captain Davis and then at the crowd, who were waiting for his words. Stephen's voice rang out calmly and decisively, like a bell heralding change. "I will not let this happen to anyone else." In those words lay the power accumulated from years of struggle, a belief in justice, and a desire to reform the system. Stephen's words resonated in people's hearts, a call to action that could no longer be ignored. The crowd erupted in louder applause. People smiled and nodded to each other, acknowledging that this moment was the beginning of change. Cameras continued recording, broadcasting this story live to the world. That day was no mere incident. It became a symbol of the fight for justice, a moment that would change many lives. The events of the day spread across social media like wildfire. Videos of the humiliation of Stephen Wilson, the Attorney General, captured from various angles, flooded news feeds. Millions watched Officer Harris tear up the documents and disrespect a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of justice. Hashtags calling for police reform trended, with commenters demanding immediate change. News broadcasts followed one another. Anchors discussed not just the incident itself, but its roots: systemic racism, bias, and abuse of power in law enforcement. Interviews with witnesses conveyed the anger and pain of people exhausted by injustice. Ordinary citizens took to the streets with signs demanding accountability and transparency from the police. The next day, a massive crowd gathered outside the courthouse. People held signs that read, "Justice for all. We demand change. Enough silence." The atmosphere was tense, but hope filled the air. People of different ages and ethnic backgrounds stood together, united by a shared goal: to achieve justice. On an improvised stage stood Stephen Wilson, his wife and children by his side. His face was calm and determined. He looked not like a man broken by the system, but like a leader ready to lead the fight for change. Journalists held microphones at the ready, cameras capturing his every word. Stephen stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent in anticipation. His voice was steady and firm. Yesterday's incident was not an isolated case. It is a symptom of a deep illness that has infected our justice system. But I promise you, our system will change. We will fight for justice for everyone, regardless of skin color or social status. His words echoed over the crowd. For a few moments there was silence, then applause swelled like a tidal wave. People chanted his name, expressing their support and belief that change was possible. Tears glistened in the eyes of many. Some held hands, aware of the importance of this moment. The elderly, who remembered times of harsher racism, and the young, who believed in a brighter future, were united in their pursuit of justice. That same day, Derek Harris's dismissal was announced. His name became a symbol of everything that needed to change in the law enforcement system. Headlines blared, "The system is cracking. Time for reform." The incident sparked new initiatives for police training, transparency, and accountability. Stephen knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. One incident was not enough to heal a system poisoned by decades of bias. But today was an important step. Today, justice prevailed. He looked at his children, who proudly held his wife's hands. In their eyes, he saw the future worth fighting for. A future where such incidents would be rare and justice would be the norm. Stephen smiled, filled with resolve. Today was a symbol that change is possible. The key was to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles.